Can a single pen change a nation? Can words be more powerful than guns? History tells us that they can. This is the story of Wole Soyinka. Playwright, poet, teacher, activist. And the first African to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. But long before the awards and international acclaim, he made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. He would never remain silent in the face of injustice. That decision came at a price. His books were banned. His speeches angered powerful men. He was forced into exile. He was locked away in solitary confinement for nearly 2 years, where his jailers hoped silence would break his spirit. It didn't. Because some voices grow stronger the harder they are pushed down. At the African Archive, we believe Africa's greatest stories are not just about kings, presidents, or battles. They are about men and women whose courage changed the way people think. If you enjoy well-researched documentaries that bring African history to life, please subscribe and join us as we uncover the remarkable lives that continue to shape our world. Before he became a Nobel laureate. Before he challenged military dictators. Before his words echoed across continents. He was simply a curious boy growing up in colonial Nigeria. A boy who loved stories. A boy who questioned authority. A boy who believed that truth should never be feared. He did not carry a sword. He carried a pen. And that pen would become one of the most powerful weapons Africa has ever known. Chapter 1. A boy who asked questions. Before the world knew him as Professor Wole Soyinka. Before he became Africa's first Nobel Prize winner in literature. Before he stood up to dictators and endured prison for speaking the truth. He was simply a boy growing up in a small Nigerian town called Abeokuta. Wole Soyinka was born on July 13, 1934, into a family that believed deeply in education, discipline, and service. His father, Samuel Soyinka, was the headmaster of St. Peter's School. To young Wole, he was a man of order and learning. At home, books were not decorations on a shelf, they were companions. His father believed that education could unlock a person's future, and he expected his children to think for themselves. His mother, Grace Iniola Soyinka, was every bit as remarkable. Known in the community as Wild Christian. She was a successful trader, a committed Christian, and a fearless activist. She later became involved in the Abeokuta Women's Union, working alongside the legendary Famileo Ransom Kuti to protest unfair taxes imposed on women by the colonial administration and the traditional authorities who supported it. From his mother, Wole learned something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. When something is wrong, you do not look away, you speak. Growing up in Abeokuta, Wole lived between two worlds. One was shaped by the traditions of the Yoruba people. Their festivals, music, proverbs, and stories passed down through generations. The other was shaped by British colonial rule, with its schools, churches, and government officials. He learned to understand both worlds. But he also noticed their contradictions. Why did some people have power while others had none? Why were ordinary people expected to obey rules that were often unfair? Why were questions sometimes treated as acts of rebellion? Unlike many children his age, Wole did not keep those questions to himself. He was curious, observant, always watching, always listening. Years later, he would capture many of these childhood memories in his memoir, The Years of Childhood, painting a vivid picture of growing up in colonial Nigeria through the eyes of a child who was already trying to understand the world around him. School quickly became a place where his imagination flourished. He loved reading. He enjoyed writing. Words fascinated him because they could do something extraordinary. They could make people laugh. They could make people think. And sometimes, they could make people change. As Nigeria moved closer to independence, young Wole was growing into a thoughtful and confident young man. He excelled in his studies and earned admission to Government College, Ibadan, one of the country's finest secondary schools. It was there that his love for literature deepened. Books were no longer just stories. They became windows into history, politics, and human nature. Without realizing it, he was preparing for a life that would be shaped by ideas. Soon, another door would open. It would lead him to the University College, Ibadan, where he would discover that words alone were not enough. Sometimes, they had to be backed by action. And it was there that the young writer would begin to find his voice. Chapter 2. Finding his voice. When Wole Soyinka arrived at University College, Ibadan, he entered the world alive with new ideas. Nigeria was still under British colonial rule, but change was in the air. Across the country, students were debating politics, freedom, culture, and the future of their nation. Wole did more than attend lectures. He listened. He questioned. He challenged ideas that did not make sense to him. He believed that a university should not simply produce graduates. It should produce thinkers. As he studied English literature, he discovered writers from around the world. But he also noticed something troubling. Too many stories about Africa were being told by people who had never truly known Africa. Its cultures were misunderstood. Its people were often portrayed through colonial stereotypes. Wole believed it was time for Africans to tell their own stories. And he intended to be one of the people who would do it. But his education was not confined to the classroom. In 1952, while still a student, Soyinka joined 6 other young men to establish the Pyrates Confraternity. Their goal was not violence. It was not intimidation. And it was certainly not the criminal activities that later became associated with campus cult groups in Nigeria. The founders wanted something entirely different. They wanted a society that rejected tribalism, racism, and social class divisions. They believed students should think independently, stand for justice, challenge hypocrisy, and refuse to follow traditions simply because they were old. For them, courage meant standing up for what was right, even when it was unpopular. Sadly, in the decades that followed, other confraternities appeared on Nigerian campuses. Many abandoned the ideals of the original Pyrates Confraternity and became known for violence, intimidation, and crime. Wole Soyinka repeatedly condemned those groups, making it clear that they had betrayed the principles on which the original confraternity had been founded. Even as a young man, one thing had become obvious. Wole Soyinka was not interested in fitting in. He was interested in making a difference. After completing his studies at Ibadan, he traveled to England and continued his education at the University of Leeds. Living abroad gave him a broader view of the world. He learned from great writers and scholars. He studied European literature. He sharpened his skills as a playwright. But the farther he traveled from home, the more clearly he saw Africa. He realized that Nigeria's stories deserved a place on the world stage. Not as tales told through colonial eyes, but through the voices of Africans themselves. Writing became more than a passion. It became a mission. He wanted to write plays that entertained. But he also wanted them to ask uncomfortable questions. Questions about power, justice, corruption, tradition, and freedom. After graduating, Soyinka worked briefly in London, gaining experience in the theater. Yet his heart remained in Nigeria. A new nation was about to be born. In 1960, Nigeria gained its independence from Britain. Like millions of Nigerians, Soyinka was hopeful. He dreamed of a country where justice would replace oppression, where leaders would serve the people, and where freedom would mean more than a change of flags. He returned home determined to help build that future. He carried no political office. He commanded no army. He possessed neither wealth nor great power. What he had were words. And before long, those words would challenge presidents, expose corruption, and make Wole Soyinka one of the most courageous voices in Africa. Chapter 3. When words became dangerous. When Wole Soyinka returned to Nigeria in the late 1950s, the country stood on the edge of history. After decades of British colonial rule, independence was finally within reach. There was excitement in the air. People dreamed of a nation built on justice, honesty, and opportunity. Like many Nigerians, Soyinka believed that independence was not the finish line. It was the beginning. The real test would come after the celebrations were over. Would Nigeria become the country its people had dreamed of? Or would new leaders repeat the mistakes of the old ones? Soyinka believed that writers had an important responsibility. Their job was not simply to entertain. Their job was to tell the truth. Even when the truth was uncomfortable. He threw himself into the world of theater. In 1960, the same year Nigeria gained independence, he founded the 1960 Masks, a theater company dedicated to producing original African plays. A few years later, he established the Horizon Theater Company, creating another platform for African storytelling and performance. Through these companies, Soyinka brought African history, culture, and traditions to life on stage. But his plays were never just performances. They were conversations with society. Sometimes they made people laugh. Sometimes they made them uncomfortable. Often, they did both. One of his most celebrated works, The Lion and the Jewel, explored the tension between tradition and modernity in a Yoruba village. Another, A Dance of the Forest, was written for Nigeria's independence celebrations. Many expected a play that simply praised the new nation. Instead, Soyinka offered something different. He warned that independence alone would not solve Nigeria's problems. If corruption, greed, and poor leadership continued, the country could still lose its way. It was a bold message. Some people applauded his honesty. Others believed he was being too critical at a moment of national celebration. Soyinka did not back down. He believed that patriotism did not mean pretending everything was perfect. Real patriotism meant helping a nation become better. As the years passed, politics in Nigeria became increasingly tense. Elections were often disputed. Accusations of corruption grew louder. Violence threatened to replace peaceful debate. Most people stayed silent. Soyinka did not. In 1965, during a disputed election in western Nigeria, he carried out one of the most daring acts of his life. Believing that the official radio station was being used to spread false election results, he secretly entered the broadcasting studio in Ibadan. There, he replaced the prepared announcement with a message urging the public to reject electoral fraud and demand the truth. The incident shocked the nation. Authorities accused him of armed robbery and other offenses, though the charges were later dismissed for lack of evidence. The event revealed something important about Wole Soyinka. He was willing to risk his own freedom if he believed justice was at stake. For him, silence was never an option. His words reached thousands. His plays filled theaters. His essays challenged those in power. Before long, government officials began to see him not simply as a writer, but as a dangerous voice. And soon, Nigeria would descend into one of the darkest chapters in its history. It was a time when speaking for peace could cost a man his freedom. For Wole Soyinka, that price was about to become very real. Chapter 4. The prison that could not silence him. By 1967, Nigeria was falling apart. Political crises had divided the country. Violence spread across different regions. Then came the event many had feared. The Nigerian Civil War, also known as the Biafran War. It would become one of the bloodiest conflicts in Africa's post-independence history. Millions of lives would be affected, and countless families would lose everything. As the nation moved toward war, Wole Soyinka refused to choose hatred over hope. He believed there had to be another way. While many voices demanded victory, Soyinka spoke of peace. He believed that if Nigerians stopped talking to one another, the country would only sink deeper into tragedy. Driven by that conviction, he secretly met with leaders on both sides of the conflict, hoping to encourage dialogue and prevent even greater bloodshed. It was an enormous risk. To the military government, his actions looked suspicious. Instead of seeing a man searching for peace, they saw someone they believed was interfering in a time of war. In August 1967, Wole Soyinka was arrested. He was accused of secretly supporting the secessionist side, an accusation he firmly denied. He was imprisoned without a proper trial. For nearly 22 months, he was held in harsh conditions. Much of that time was spent in solitary confinement. Imagine being locked inside a small cell. No family. No friends. Very little human contact. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. For many people, such isolation would have broken their spirit. But not Wole Soyinka. The government could lock away his body. It could not imprison his mind. Denied books and writing materials for long periods. Soyinka found ways to keep his thoughts alive. He composed poems in his head. Repeated them over and over so he would not forget them. And wrote secretly whenever he found the chance. Writing became an act of survival. Every poem was a quiet act of resistance. Every sentence reminded him that he was still free in one important way. He could still think. Years later, he would describe these painful experiences in books such as The Man Died, offering the world a powerful account of life inside prison and the dangers of political oppression. One line from that book would become one of his most famous quotations. "The man dies in all who keep silent in the face of tyranny." Those words captured everything he believed. Silence protects injustice. Courage challenges it. In 1969, after almost 2 years behind bars, Soyinka was finally released. He walked out of prison thinner, older, and deeply affected by what he had endured. But he was not defeated. If anything, prison had strengthened his resolve. The authorities had hoped that isolation would silence one of Nigeria's boldest voices. Instead, they had given that voice even greater power. The years ahead would take Wole Soyinka far beyond Nigeria. His words would cross continents. His plays would reach audiences around the world. And before long, the world itself would recognize the extraordinary power of the pen that refused to be silenced. Chapter 5. The world listened. When Wole Soyinka walked out of prison in 1969, he was free. But Nigeria was still struggling. The Civil War had left deep wounds. Families had been torn apart. Communities had been divided. The nation faced the difficult task of rebuilding itself. For Soyinka, prison had changed many things. But it had not changed his purpose. If anything, it had made him even more determined. He returned to writing with renewed energy. His plays, essays, poems, and lectures continued to ask difficult questions about power, justice, corruption, and the responsibility of leaders. He believed that freedom meant little if people were too afraid to speak the truth. Over the following years, Soyinka's reputation grew far beyond Nigeria. His works were performed in theaters across Africa, Europe, and the United States. Students studied his books. Scholars debated his ideas. Audiences admired the way he blended Yoruba culture with universal themes of justice, identity, and human dignity. Yet international recognition never changed the man. He remained outspoken. Whether criticizing military dictators in Nigeria or condemning injustice anywhere in the world, Soyinka refused to soften his voice to make powerful people comfortable. That courage came with a cost. There were periods when he chose exile rather than risk imprisonment or assassination under military rule. Even while living outside Nigeria, he never stopped speaking about his homeland. Distance did not weaken his commitment. It strengthened it. Then, in 1986, history was made. The Swedish Academy announced that Wole Soyinka had been awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. At the age of 52, he became the first African to receive the award in literature. The announcement was celebrated across Nigeria, across Africa, and around the world. For many Africans, it was more than a personal achievement. It was recognition that African literature belonged among the greatest literary traditions on earth. Soyinka accepted the honor with humility. He knew the Nobel Prize was not the end of his journey. It was another opportunity to shine a light on Africa's stories, and on the struggles of ordinary people whose voices were too often ignored. Even after receiving the world's highest literary honor, he continued to write. He continued to teach. He continued to speak out against oppression, whether it came from military governments, corrupt politicians, or extremists who used violence to silence others. Many people wondered why he never chose the easier path. The answer could be found in the life he had lived. From the lessons he learned from his mother in Abeokuta, to the ideals he embraced as a student, to the silence of a prison cell. Every chapter of his life had taught him the same lesson. A writer's greatest responsibility is not to please those in power. It is to tell the truth. And Wole Soyinka never forgot that responsibility. By now, his words had traveled further than he ever imagined. But his greatest legacy was still taking shape. It would not be measured by medals, or by awards, or even by the Nobel Prize. It would be measured by the countless people he inspired to think for themselves, to question injustice, and to refuse to be silent. Chapter 6. A pen that still speaks. In 1986, Wole Soyinka became the first African to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. It was a historic moment. But if you had asked Soyinka himself what mattered most, he probably would not have pointed to the medal. He would have pointed to the ideas behind his work. For him, writing was never about fame. It was about freedom. In the years that followed, Soyinka continued to write plays, poems, essays, memoirs, and novels. He taught at universities around the world, inspiring new generations of writers, thinkers, and activists. But even as his reputation grew, he remained the same man who had questioned authority as a boy in Abeokuta. Whenever he believed leaders were abusing their power, he spoke out. Whether the government was civilian or military, whether the injustice happened in Nigeria or elsewhere, his voice remained consistent. That courage sometimes came at a personal cost. There were periods when threats to his life forced him into exile. Yet even far from home, he never stopped speaking about Nigeria or calling for democracy, accountability, and respect for human rights. His love for his country was never blind. He celebrated Nigeria's achievements, but he also challenged its failures. He believed that true patriotism was not about praising a nation all the time. It was about helping it become better. Over the decades, Soyinka received countless honors from universities, literary organizations, and governments around the world. Yet perhaps his greatest achievement cannot be measured by awards. It can be found in the generations he inspired. Young writers discovered that African stories deserve to be told by Africans. Students learned that education should lead to independent thinking, not blind obedience. Citizens saw that one person, armed only with courage and conviction, could challenge even the most powerful government. Today, Wole Soyinka is regarded as one of the greatest writers Africa has ever produced. His books continue to be read in classrooms across the world. His plays are still performed. His essays continue to provoke debate. And his words still remind us that freedom is never guaranteed. It must be defended. Not only by soldiers, but also by teachers, journalists, artists, students, and ordinary citizens who refuse to accept injustice as normal. Looking back on his extraordinary life, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Wole Soyinka did not fight with armies. He did not seek political office. He did not build his legacy through wealth or power. He fought with ideas, with courage, with truth, and with a pen. That is why dictators feared his words more than his presence. Because prisons can hold a body, but they cannot imprison an idea whose time has come. Long after the prison doors were opened, long after the dictators who tried to silence him had faded into history, his words remained. They still challenge us to ask difficult questions. They still remind us that silence can be a form of surrender. And they still inspire millions to speak the truth, even when it is costly. That is the legacy of Wole Soyinka, the man whose pen would not be silenced.